Hello, my constitutional scholars. We're continuing our series on the three branches of government. And today you can see by that bright yellow word and the circled branch, we're going to be focusing on the executive branch today. So the executive branch of the United States government is basically the president, but we're going to be seeing that there's more to the president than just the president. We're also going to be seeing that the president does not have the amount of power that we all feel like the president has. So we're going to be looking at what the president actually can do. Remember, the president or the executive branch is one of three branches of government, and all three of these branches have equal power, equal control of the others. So they have to work together to run our country. Now, oftentimes, instead of working together, these branches work against each other, and they make it harder to get things done and slower to make changes. Sometimes that can actually be a good thing. Sometimes too much change too fast could actually hurt the country. And so our system kind of says, okay, wait, let's slow down. Let's make sure we really want to do this. Does everybody want to make this change? And so that's why we have these three branches, to make sure that we don't change too much too fast, that we don't get too much control in any one place, and everything kind of stays balanced. So when all three branches work really well together, then things can seriously get done and we can make change. I'm not sure that's ever actually happened in all of United States history. There's always been some part of our government that's kind of pushing back against the other. And that's why change takes time, right? It takes a lot of time for everyone to finally say, okay, now we're ready to make this change. So whenever you're thinking of the president and they're campaigning and running for election, and they make all these promises that they'll do this and they'll do that, most of the time, they can't because there's two other branches of the government that are also at work that need to work together to make those things happen. So the president, like I said, he only has 1/3 of the power in all of the government. But we often feel like the president is the most powerful person because, well, there are 9 Supreme Court justices in the judicial branch, right? So there's 9 people at the head of the judicial branch. The legislative branch has 535 Congress people. That's a lot of power to spread around 535 people. The executive branch is headed by one person, and that's the president. So if there is one single person in our government that has the most control, it probably is the president, because that is one person in charge of that entire branch, right? Whereas the other branches, they have to kind of share their control or their power with multiple people at the head of their branch. So here's that infographic again, looking at our Constitution in total: legislative, executive, judicial branch. And today our focus is going to be the executive branch. So again, I've been talking about the president, but there's a little more to it than that. There's also the vice president and the cabinet. So we'll be talking about some of their jobs too. The vice president doesn't really have a lot of jobs. The vice president's main job is to sit in that big fancy chair in front of the Senate and run the meetings. That is what the vice president does. The vice president sits in front of the Senate and just like runs the Senate meeting. And that's about it. Now, every once in a while, if the Senate needs a tie-breaking vote, which is rare, but it does happen. So if you ever need a tie-breaking vote in the Senate, then the vice president gets to cast that vote. So oftentimes things lean the way the vice president wants them to go because they get to be the tie-breaking vote sometimes. But otherwise, that's really all the vice president is really in charge of, is sitting in front of the Senate and running that meeting. And then, of course, if the president dies, then the vice president becomes the president. So they got that going for them, right? So let's take a look at what the president can actually do and some of their qualifications. So the president can serve for 4 years. It's a 4-year term, but you may serve 2 terms. So you can run for re-election. So you can be president for a total of 8 years. We have had a president in the past. I think it was Grover Cleveland, or was it Taft? I think it was Cleveland. No, it was Taft. No, I don't remember. It was one of those guys who rather heavy set with a mustache. They like look the same in pictures. So it was one of them, served 4 years and then wasn't president for the next 4 years and then ran again and became president for another 4 years. So those 2 terms don't have to be back to back. Also, we have had a president serve more than 2 terms, and it was Franklin Roosevelt. President Roosevelt served 4 terms. He was elected, and then he was reelected, and then he was reelected, and then he was re-elected again. But he didn't finish out his 4th term because sadly he died while he was in office. So I think he was president for more like about 13 years instead of a full 16 with his 4 terms. One of the reasons that they kept on re-electing him is because he is the president who was president when the Great Depression ended, right? So he's given credit for bringing the country out of the Great Depression. Now, it could have been any other guy, but because it was Roosevelt, he kind of gets credit for doing that. And so the people of our country loved the guy because he brought us out of the Great Depression. And so they kept on voting for him and voting for him and voting for him. Luckily for us, he was a pretty good president and did a lot of really good things, but it could have gone the other way, right? So after Roosevelt was president, that's when we changed our Constitution and we created an amendment that says, so a president can only serve 2 terms. Let's not have any more of this 4 or more term nonsense. We don't want to let one person have that much control of our country for that much time. So let's put a cap. Someone can be president for 2 terms instead of unlimited terms. So it was kind of like our warning after seeing that the people voted for the same person again and again and again. We realized that could be a dangerous recipe in the future. So let's put a stop to that. So now a president can be president for 2 terms. You have to be 35 years old in order to be president, or at least 35 years old. You need to be a natural born citizen. Now, the president of the United States is the only elected official in our country that needs to be born in the United States. All other elected officials simply need to be citizens, right? They don't have to have been born in the United States. But this has gone back to the very beginning. One of the reasons why they thought it was so important that the president be born in the United States is because our first presidents, think back to the Revolution, the first presidents could have possibly maybe been from England, right? And so they wanted to make sure that whoever was running the United States was truly for the United States and not from somewhere else that might, change things back to the way they were back when we were colonies. So these days, that might not be as necessary of a thing, but that's still the law. That's still in our Constitution, that the president must be born in the United States. They also need to have been a resident for at least 14 years. They need to have lived here for 14 years as well. So that means you could be born in the United States and then leave and go live in another country and then come back, but you need to have been an established resident of the United States for at least 14 years, right? The president's main job is to enforce laws. Remember, the president does not create laws. The president does not make new laws. That's the legislative branch, right? That's what Congress does. But what the president does do is sign those laws. So Congress comes up with the ideas for the laws and they say, we want this to happen. And they put it in front of the president's desk and the president signs it and it becomes a law. Or, as we heard, the president can veto that law. The president can say no. He can put his big old veto stamp on it and say, I don't want that to become a law. That's quite a bit of power, right? It comes down to one person deciding if laws become laws or not. But the president can't come up with the laws. He can't tell Congress what to do. He can ask them. The president can go to Congress and say, will you pretty please make a law that says this? And if you do, I will sign it. And so then Congress debates and argues and figures it out. And then they put it in front of the president's desk and he signs it. Okay. Once a law becomes signed by the president, then it is the executive branch's job. So all of the people that work for the president, it's their job to enforce that law. It's their job to implement that law, to make it happen, right? So here's an example. A couple years ago when the pandemic broke out, Congress passed a law through Congress that gave stimulus checks to everybody, right? Everybody got money from the government to kind of help us get through the pandemic. So Congress wrote that law, the president signed it, and then it became the president's job to make sure that everybody in the country actually got those checks. Now, when I say the president's job, I don't mean one person was like licking stamps and sending them out to 500 million people. But instead, it's the people that work under the president that had to make that happen, right? The different agencies. And we'll be looking at those in just a second. So other jobs of the president, we talked about, he can veto laws or reject them. The president can appoint Supreme Court justices. In other words, if there is an opening in the Supreme Court, if a Supreme Court justice dies or retires from that job, then the president gets to choose the person to replace them. Now, the president gets to pick the person, but then Congress or the legislative branch gets to approve or affirm or confirm that decision. So the president gets to pick the person, but then Congress has the final say, right? The president is also the commander-in-chief of the military. So once Congress declares war, then the president is in charge of that war. And the president is the one that tells the leading generals of the armed forces what to do. The president can also grant pardons. Now, this is an interesting one. To grant a pardon means basically to let someone out of prison. If someone's been accused and convicted of a crime and they're serving out their sentence in prison, the president can forgive them. The president can pardon them of their crime and they can be set free. Now, why would you ever want to do that? Let criminals free? Because sometimes, you guys, the justice system is broken. And every once in a while, the court systems might send somebody to prison who was wrongfully accused and wrongfully convicted. And so this is another check to balance the power. This way, the judicial branch can't get too much control and start sending a whole bunch of people to prison because they feel like it, because the president has the power to undo it, right? Now, presidents don't just go willy-nilly like, show me a list of convicts and let me release them. Oftentimes they hear these cases and they realize this person might be really, really innocent. Let me have my people look into that, right? Oftentimes presidents don't do pardons until the end of their term as president, because it can be a really controversial thing. And if they want to be reelected, then they don't want to go around saying, oh, I just let all these people out of prison. Now you should elect me again. So oftentimes they wait until the end of their term when they know that they're going to be leaving the presidency to follow through with a lot of their pardons. Unless, of course, it's someone who's very, very deserving and wrongfully convicted and should be released and everyone knows it. And the president can then do that, right? The president also makes treaties. In other words, deals or relationships with other countries. As kind of the figurehead of the country, the president can go to other countries and visit with other leaders and strike deals with them, whether it's treaties about war and supporting each other with our militaries, or treaties with trade and shipping goods back and forth between countries, the president can make those. But again, Congress has to approve those treaties. So here's a graphic that kind of shows us the different powers or the different jobs of the president. So just quickly going around, we've talked about most of these already. The president can approve or veto, or in other words, say no to bills or laws that are passed by Congress. He prepares the federal budget, but Congress has to approve it. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They're in charge of the military. They can pardon those who are guilty of crimes against the federal government. So that's important to keep in mind, that the president can only pardon people for federal crimes. The president can't pardon someone who committed a crime in a state or a city, right? They can only pardon federal crimes, so bigger crimes. The president also conducts relations by making treaties with other countries. They appoint cabinet members and ambassadors and federal judges. The president also keeps Congress informed of what's going on in the country, and the president can propose laws. So he can come up with ideas, he just can't make things laws, right? The president can sign things into law. So I mentioned before that the president, or rather the executive branch, is more than just the president and the vice president. It's also what's called the cabinet. And the cabinet is kind of a funny way of saying group of people who are in charge of things. So the president oversees all of these different departments, right? The president is in charge of the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice and the Department of the Treasury. All of these different departments are different pieces of the executive branch. So this is what I'm talking about, how the president enforces laws. It ends up being these different departments that actually make things happen. And each of these departments has thousands of people working there. So the president is in charge of all of them. Now that's a really, really big job. So instead of the president doing it all, the president appoints secretaries of each of these departments. So we have the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Education. We have all these different secretaries that are in charge of all these different departments that make the government work, right? These are the departments, these are the bodies in our government that make stuff happen for us. And the president can't be in charge of all of them, so the president gets to appoint secretaries. And those secretaries of all these departments end up being called his cabinet. So it's really like a group of advisors that tell the president, well, this is what's going on in defense, and this is what's going on in health and human services, and this is what's going on in justice. And the president gets to hear that and work with the secretaries of those departments to enforce laws and make things happen. So the executive branch is actually a huge branch of the government. It's not just the president and the vice president, but it does all come down to the president. And that's why we often feel like the president is the most powerful person in the country, because that one person does oversee all of these things, right? He's kind of like the ultimate CEO of the country. But remember, the president does not have more power than the legislative branch or the judicial branch, right? They just do different things, and they have to work with each other or against each other, right? So different checks and balances. We're going to narrow things down and just look at the executive branch. And again, we've talked about all these things. This just shows us the different ways that the executive branch or the president can check on the other branches. So in order to check on the legislative branch, the president proposes laws, vetoes laws. The president can call a special session of Congress. In other words, he can say, hey, all of you come to Washington, D.C. now. We need to talk about something. He can make appointments, and that means to choose a person to lead a certain part or a certain department of our country. And then he negotiates those foreign treaties, right? To check on the judicial branch, pretty straightforward. The president can appoint federal judges. So the president gets to choose our Supreme Court justices. And then remember, the legislative branch approves or confirms those choices. And then the president can also grant pardons. So if somebody is wrongfully imprisoned for a federal crime, the president can undo that, just to make sure the judicial branch doesn't abuse their power, right? So those are some of the checks and balances. And that is kind of the executive branch in a nutshell.